The morning I handed my parents the keys to a $390,000 lakeside cabin, my mother was being told to get out of her own kitchen. I didn't know that yet. I was still in the driveway, heart pounding, holding a small envelope with a brass key inside and a card I'd rewritten 4 times. I'd driven 3 hours from Portland. I hadn't slept well in 2 days. Not because I was nervous about the gift, I'd been planning it for 14 months, but because I kept waking up thinking, what if they cry? What if Dad cries and I cry, and we're all just standing there crying in a parking lot? What actually happened was worse than that, and better. But mostly, for a while, worse. Let me start at the beginning because none of this makes sense unless you understand who my parents are. My dad, Owen, spent 31 years doing HVAC work. He's the kind of man who shows up early and leaves late and never once complained about it in front of us. My mom, Nora, was a home health aide for 26 years. She took care of strangers' parents with the same patience she gave us. They raised 3 kids in a small house in Beaverton, Oregon, and they did it on 2 incomes that were never quite enough but somehow always sufficient. We never went hungry. We always had school supplies. Christmas was modest, but it was real. They got married 49 years ago in a church that no longer exists. Last October, they were coming up on their 50th anniversary, and I had been quietly, carefully saving for this moment since the October before that. I'm a software engineer. I've been at my company for 6 years, made senior 2 years ago, and I've been intentional about money in a way that took me a long time to learn. I don't say that to brag. I say it because it matters to the story. I knew how to structure a purchase. I knew how to protect it. And I did. The cabin sits on the eastern shore of Subtle Lake, about 2.5 hours from Portland. 3 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, a dock that needs some work but holds just fine, and a view of the water that, I'm not exaggerating, made me catch my breath the first time I saw it. I found it in August of last year. The owner was a retired teacher who'd inherited it and couldn't maintain it anymore. We closed in September. I paid cash and put the deed in my name with the intention of transferring it to my parents at their anniversary party. I told no one. Not my best friend, not my therapist, not even my coworker Jen, who I tell everything to. Just me and my real estate attorney Beverly, who helped me structure the transfer correctly so there would be no gift tax complications and no ambiguity about ownership. Beverly was wonderful, very calm, very thorough. She told me, make sure the transfer documents are signed and notarized before you present this publicly. I did exactly that. The party was planned for the 3rd Saturday in October. My older brother Derek said he'd handle the venue, a rented hall near my parents' house. My younger brother, Seth, was supposed to do the food. I said I'd cover decorations in the big surprise. Derek asked me once, maybe 6 weeks before, what the surprise was. I told him I'd gotten Mom and Dad a trip. I don't know why I said that. Instinct, maybe. Something in how he asked. A little too casual, leaning in a little too much. Derek has always had a way of asking questions that aren't really questions. He's 43. I'm 32. We've never been close in the way that people imagine siblings are close. He's smart and he knows it, and he spent most of his adult life making sure everyone else knows it too. His wife Tammy is the same. They have 2 kids and a house in the suburbs, and a lifestyle that costs more than Derek earns. Though I only learned the details of that much later. The week before the party, I drove up to the cabin alone to air it out, stock the pantry with a few things, leave some fresh towels, make it feel like a home and not an empty property. I spent a Saturday there. I sat on the porch and watched the light come off the water, and I thought about my mom's face when she saw it. I thought about my dad standing on that dock with a cup of coffee. I let myself be happy about it. Then I drove back to Portland and finished my work week and packed my car and drove to Beaverton for the party. I knew something was wrong before I reached the front door. My parents weren't at the hall. The party was supposed to start at 2. It was 1:45. I'd assumed they were already there, since Derek had told me he was picking them up at 1. But when I pulled into the parking lot, I saw Seth standing outside with his hands in his pockets, staring at his phone with a look I recognized. The look he gets when he knows something bad is happening and doesn't know what to do about it. I rolled down my window. "Where are Mom and Dad?" He looked up. Derek took them home. There was some kind of fight. What kind of fight? He shook his head slowly. I don't know everything. But it's about the cabin. I felt the ground shift under me, which is a strange thing to feel when you're sitting in a car. What about the cabin? He found the deed. I don't know how. He's saying, Seth stopped, looked away. He's saying you've been hiding assets from the family. I drove to my parents' house. I don't remember the drive. I remember parking and sitting in the car for about 30 seconds and telling myself to breathe, and then I got out and walked to the front door and I could hear Derek's voice before I even touched the handle. I walked in. My mother was standing at the kitchen counter with her arms crossed tight over her chest and she was crying. Not the soft kind, the kind where your whole body is involved, where your shoulders shake. My father was sitting at the kitchen table with his hands flat on the surface and his eyes down. He looked about 10 years older than he had at Thanksgiving. Tammy was leaning against the doorframe with an expression I can only describe as satisfied. Derek turned when I came in. There she is, he said. I looked at my mother first, then my father, then back at Derek. What's happening? I said. I'll tell you what's happening, he said. You bought a $390,000 property and didn't tell anyone. You've been sitting on it for a year, and now you want to do some big reveal at mom and dad's party like you're some kind of hero, and the whole time you've been lying to this family. I said, I wasn't lying. I was planning a surprise. A surprise. He laughed, but not like anything was funny. You know what I think? I think you're trying to control them. I think you buy them a cabin so now you get to decide when they go, who visits, what happens to it when they're gone. That's not a gift, that's a leash. My mother made a sound. I looked at her. Mom. She shook her head. Couldn't speak yet. My father finally looked up. Sweetheart, he said, and his voice was so careful, so tired. Did you really buy a cabin? Yes, I said. For you and Mom. For your anniversary. I've been planning it for over a year. He closed his eyes for a moment. Derek said, and did you know that a transfer of that size has tax implications for them? Did you think about what that means for people on a fixed income? Or were you just thinking about how it would look? I had, in fact, thought about all of that extensively. Beverly and I had structured the transfer specifically to avoid gift tax issues under the annual exclusion limits and lifetime exemption. The property taxes on the cabin were folded into a small trust I'd set up. My parents would have zero financial burden. I said all of this, calmly, in detail. Derek blinked. Tammy's expression shifted slightly. Just slightly. You set up a trust? Derek said. Yes. For how much? Enough to cover property taxes and basic maintenance for 15 years. There was a silence. Then Derek said, I want to see the documents. And here's where I need to tell you something about myself. I am not a confrontational person by nature. I spent most of my childhood being the one who smoothed things over, who backed down, who found a way to make everyone comfortable at the expense of being honest. I went to therapy for 2 years, partly to unlearn that. My therapist has a saying she borrowed from somewhere. A boundary isn't a door slamming shut. It's a door with a handle, so people know where the entrance is. I thought about that in the kitchen that afternoon. I said, no. Derek stared at me. The documents are between me, my attorney, and Mom and Dad, I said. I'll share them with Mom and Dad privately today, whenever they're ready. But I'm not presenting them to you in a kitchen while you interrogate me. This is a family matter. Yes, I said. It is, and Mom and Dad are the family this gift is for. He took a step toward me. My father stood up from the table. He didn't say anything. He just stood up. And Derek stopped. That moment, my 68-year-old father, who has a bad knee and a hearing aid and hands that shake a little now from an old injury, just standing up quietly, that was the moment I came closest to crying. I didn't, but it was close. Derek said something to Tammy in a low voice. She nodded. He turned back to me. You've always thought you were better than everyone in this family, he said. That's what this is. I didn't answer that. He and Tammy left. The front door closed. I heard their car start. My mother was still crying, but softer now. I went to her and put my arm around her, and she leaned into me and we stood like that for a moment. My father came and put his hand on her back. How long have you been planning this? He asked. 14 months, I said. He made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "Can I show you pictures?" I said. My mother laughed a little despite herself. We sat at the kitchen table, the three of us, and I pulled up the photos on my phone. The wraparound porch. The dock. The way the water looks in the morning. The bedroom with the quilt I picked out in a shop in Sisters because it was the same colors as the quilt my grandmother used to have. My mother covered her mouth with her hand. My father leaned in close, the way he does when he's trying to see something clearly. "The dock," he said. "Needs some work," I said. "But it holds." "I can fix a dock," he said. "I know. That's why I didn't fix it." I drove them up to the cabin 2 days later, on a Monday, because the party had obviously not happened the way any of us planned. And because I wanted them to see it before anyone else had a chance to make it complicated again. My mother stood on the porch for a long time without saying anything. My father walked down to the dock and stood there with his hands in his jacket pockets looking out at the water. I stayed back by the car and gave them space. After a while, my mother turned around and looked at me across the yard. "Nora," I said. I've called her by her first name as a joke since I was about 15. It started as a teenager thing and it stuck. "Stop looking at me like that." "Like what?" she said. "Like you feel guilty." She pressed her lips together. "This isn't a leash," I said, before she could say anything. "It's a place. It's yours. You go when you want. You invite who you want. I'm not attached to it. I wanted you to have somewhere beautiful. You both worked so hard for so long and I wanted you to have somewhere that was just yours." She walked across the yard and hugged me so hard I felt it in my teeth. My father came back up from the dock. He put his hand on top of my head, the way he used to when I was small. "Thank you," he said. That was it. Just that. The next few weeks were not simple. Derek called my parents twice trying to, I think, reframe what had happened, positioning himself as the one who was just asking questions, and me as someone who had been secretive. My mother told me about the calls without me asking. She didn't seem swayed. My father didn't engage with it at all, which is very him. I got one text from Derek directly about a week later. It said, "I think you could have handled this better." I read it 3 times. I thought about what I wanted to say. I thought about the 14 months of saving and planning and researching tax law and driving up to the cabin alone on weekends to make sure the pipes weren't freezing. I thought about my mother's face on the porch. My father on the dock. I wrote back, "I hope we can move forward." And then I put my phone down and I made dinner and I called my mom to check in and she told me she'd hung a bird feeder off the porch railing and there were already 2 chickadees. There's something I want to say to anyone who's ever been in a version of this situation. Not the cabin part. I know that's specific. I mean the part where you do something kind, something that costs you real time and real money and real love, and someone else finds a way to make it about control or deception or ego. I've thought about this a lot. I don't think Derek did what he did because he's purely malicious. I think he's a person who has spent a long time feeling like he should be the one in charge, and when something happened that he wasn't in charge of, his brain told him it was an attack. That doesn't make it okay. It just makes it comprehensible. The thing I keep coming back to is Beverly's advice, the first time I sat in her office and explained what I wanted to do. She looked at me over her reading glasses and she said, "If you're going to do something this significant, protect it like you mean it. Not because your family is untrustworthy, because the documentation is how you love them. The paperwork is what makes this real." I didn't fully understand that at the time. I do now. The deed is in my parents' names. The trust is established. The cabin belongs to them completely and is protected from any claims or complications. I am not on it. I don't need to be. That's not what this was about. Last month I drove up to visit them for a long weekend. My mother had reorganized the kitchen, which was completely unnecessary since it was already well stocked, but she is who she is. My father had fixed the dock, added new planks, replaced a rusted cleat, repainted the end of it in a dark green that looks like it was always supposed to be there. We sat out there the first evening, the 3 of us, with cups of tea, watching the light go flat on the water the way it does just before dark. Nobody said much. There wasn't a lot that needed saying. At some point, my mother reached over and squeezed my hand. I thought about all of it, the 14 months. The early mornings checking mortgage rates even though I was paying cash, just to understand the market. The weekends researching trust structures. The 4 drafts of the anniversary card that I never actually used, because in the end I just handed them the key and they understood. I thought about Derek in that kitchen, and how his voice had been so loud, and how strange it is that sometimes the people who shout the most are the ones with the least to say. I thought about my father standing up from the table. Just standing up. I thought about Beverly in her calm office telling me the paperwork is how you love them, and I sat there on that dock in the last light and I thought, I did this right. Not perfectly, not without hurt, but right. The chickadees my mother mentioned were still around. She'd added a second feeder by then. There were 4 of them when I left Sunday afternoon, small and quick and unbothered, doing exactly what they were supposed to do. I don't know what happens next with Derek. I genuinely don't. We haven't spoken beyond that one text exchange and a brief, polite moment at Thanksgiving where we were both so careful with each other that it was almost funny. Maybe it gets better, maybe it doesn't. I've stopped making his comfort my responsibility. What I know is this: my parents have a place on the water that's theirs. My father has a dock he fixed with his own hands. My mother has a kitchen she reorganized for no reason. And on a Sunday evening in November, the 3 of us sat outside with tea and watched the light leave the lake, and it was enough. It was more than enough. Love is not a blank check, but it can be a deed. It can be a dock. It can be a second bird feeder and 2 chickadees and a quilt in the right colors and the sound of your father's footsteps on wood he repaired himself. That's what I wanted, and that's what it was. I've thought a lot about what my dad did in that kitchen. Not what he said. He barely said anything. He just stood up, slowly, with his bad knee, both hands pressing flat on the table first, and then he was standing, and Derek stopped mid-sentence. That image keeps coming back to me because I think it says something true about how quiet dignity actually works. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't argue. It just takes up space, and the people who are counting on you to stay small suddenly realize their math was wrong. I used to think that doing something good meant the outcome would be clean. You give a gift, people receive it with gratitude. Everyone goes home feeling warm. That's not how it works, or at least, it's not how it worked for me. What I learned from this whole experience is that the integrity of an action doesn't live in how it's received. It lives in why you did it and how carefully you protected it. I spent 14 months planning. I consulted an attorney. I established a trust. I drove up alone on weekends to make sure the pipes were fine. None of that was about control. It was about love that took the form of responsibility. And when Derek tried to reframe that as manipulation, it didn't land. Because the documentation told a different story than he did. That's the thing about doing something right. It has a paper trail. I also think about the version of me that existed before therapy, before I started understanding what it meant to hold a boundary without apologizing for it. That version of me would have crumbled in that kitchen, would have started explaining myself in a way that looked like begging, would have handed Derek the documents just to make the tension stop. I've spent years unlearning that reflex, the one that tells you keeping the peace is worth more than keeping your self-respect. It isn't. Peace that requires you to abandon what's true isn't peace. It's just a different kind of war you're losing more slowly. Derek's behavior that day came from somewhere real. I do believe that. People don't grab for control unless they feel like they've been losing it for a long time. That doesn't excuse what he did to my parents, or the smug look on Tammy's face, or the way he tried to make my mother question something I had done entirely out of love. But understanding where something comes from helps me carry it without it turning into bitterness. I don't want to be bitter. Bitterness is just grief that never found anywhere to go. What I want, what I'm still working toward, is to be the kind of person who acts from her values and then lets the results be what they are. My parents have the cabin. My dad fixed the dock with his own hands. My mom hung 2 bird feeders and reorganized a kitchen that didn't need reorganizing. That's real. That happened because of a decision I made, protected, and stood behind. And if I'm being honest, standing behind it, quietly, in that kitchen, without raising my voice, might be the thing I'm most proud of. Not the money, not the property, not even the look on my mother's face when she saw the water for the first time. Just that moment of knowing what I was doing was right and not letting anyone take that from me.